Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richman, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. Sheldon, one of the burning issues that we have to put up with year after year after year around this time, 2 weeks from now, is income tax day, when everybody dutifully marches over to the post office and gets their tax return filed on time and postmarked and so forth, dutifully reporting how much money they received and how much taxes they owe, and some people grateful that they're getting money back from the government. I mean, this is really a remarkable thing about what goes for a free society and what they've told us is a free society. And you've written this great book for FFF on this subject, Your Money or Your Life, Why We Must Abolish the Income Tax. So I figured, this would be an appropriate time to visit the issue. Maybe we'll visit it again on April 15th. But since we're coming up on this thing, I think we ought to talk about this, especially in the context of a free society. What do you think?
Well, I agree totally. People have been so anesthetized on this. I don't know why every year they're not fuming that they have to make this report, that they have to make this accounting to the government, how much they were paid, how much they might have given to charity, deductions. They have to make this accounting to the state and send it in under threat that if they've gotten something wrong, they could be charged with fraud. Or certainly the government can come back to you for money that you didn't send, but it believes it's owed. And everybody does it with some trepidation because there are, I don't know what the policy is these days, whether there are random audits or whether they only go after people they have some specific reason to target. I'm not up on the latest practices of the IRS in that respect, but everybody must be a little bit nervous that maybe their return will get it going over. And I have no doubt that just about everyone in the country who files a return has in some way violated the tax code. It seems to be the odds of that are about of that happening are about 99.999 to 1, because the tax code is so complex. It's impossible that most people haven't violated it in some way. I don't mean knowingly, but just did, because it's so complex. So why aren't people screaming around this time of year saying, why do we have to do this? One possible answer I have to that is it's both a tribute and a curse of private enterprise. Private firms have taken a lot of the pain out of the income tax. You can file online. You can get software. It's even free stuff now that lets you do your return. If your return is simple enough, you can do it online instead of poring over the papers and with your calculator and trying to figure it all out. It's all done for you because of computing power, and it's taken the sting out of it. And in a way, that's a bad thing. Maybe we should propose a law to outlaw anything that makes it easier to pay your income taxes.
Yeah, your point is very, very well taken about the complexity of the tax code and how people inevitably live in fear that they're going to get audited and checked and then possibly prosecuted or fined for having, put in the wrong provision, the wrong deductions or something. And I'm sure there's a lot of people cheating, so that's got to be on their minds of, oh my gosh, I can't do anything to raise attention to myself. So it seems to me this is the perfect device to keep people down, to keep them from protesting other actions of the government, what the government's doing overseas, the CIA, the military, or whatever. Because as soon as you have a high enough profile that you're on their radar screen, the first thing they're going to do, and when we've learned this in history where presidents use this power, the first thing they do is they go after him on income taxation, scour his return with a fine-tooth comb, and they inevitably find something. It's sort of like insider trading laws or any other type of economic crime. And they come up with something and they prosecute him, and then they play the innocent. They say, oh, no, we believe in free speech, but he just happened to have taken this wrong deduction or this wrong loophole, and we just don't have any choice but to go after him. I think that's one of the real purposes of the income tax. And if you look at some of the debates that went into the income tax, there were people saying this. I just got through reading this great book from the 50s by Frank Shuttleroff, the old time individualist libertarian. His book's called The Income Tax Root of All Evil. And he was quoting people in there saying, this kind of system turns into an inquisitorial system where it's like the Inquisition. And where you're presumed guilty, where the IRS has omnipotent power over you. It can do effectively whatever it wants, seize your property, file liens against you without going to court. I think it's one of the most powerful agencies in history. And I think it's entirely designed to remain complex in order to suppress dissent in this country.
Well, it certainly has the power to do that. We know that it's done it over many years. Presidents have used it to get political enemies. And so that potential is always there. And, you just never know if it's happening or not. But it's a powerful tool, and presidents have found it irresistible to use it against political enemies, even some very high profile people, like a former Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, who was hounded by the IRS under Roosevelt. He was in the he was Treasury Secretary in the Coolidge administration and I guess the Hoover administration, and then they went after him. So it's just, that's an argument against the income tax. Even if you could come up with no other argument, that it gives such a dangerous tool to the executive that nobody can be trusted with power like that. Nobody should be trusted, and. But it slipped by. You're right. The word inquisitorial was constantly raised when the income tax was proposed, from the very start. Unfortunately, a deal with the devil was made by free traders who were trying to get the tariff lowered, and they in the late 19th century were willing to make a trade a small income tax, and the first income tax, of course, was always very low to begin with, and it only affected the very high end of income earners. But they made a deal. Okay, look, we'll give the government this source of revenue. We'll keep it small in return for big reductions in the tariff. And of course, in the end, we got high tariffs because of the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, and then the income tax, which has been a burden ever since. So it was a terrible deal to make. It's just too bad they fell for that.
Yeah, they should have known. This notion that you're going to keep a tax in existence like a tariff and just lower it a little bit in return for a brand new tax. Who could fall for such a thing? If you're going to replace one tax with another tax, abolish the first tax. Get rid of it entirely. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't enact it at the same, down the road, but at least it makes it more difficult to do as compared to just raising the tariff again after you get the income tax in. But, I'd like to talk about it in terms of a free society. To me, that's really what Americans ought to be debating, because, we're all born and raised in this system. I think everyone living today is, just accustomed to the idea that we live with the IRS, we live with the income tax, that it's inevitable, that this is just the way life is. And of course, they convince themselves that they're free. And you see this at all these sporting events where people with tears in their eyes, say, oh, thank God I'm an American, because at least I know I'm free, unlike those people in communist countries that they're not free. Well, our ancestors who lived without an income tax for most of America's history in the first 100 years. There was the exception. Lincoln enacted an income tax to fund his war. And then you had the income tax in I think it was 1894. But other than that, Americans lived without an income tax from 1787 on to 1916, somewhere in that period, first part of the 20th century. And their concept of freedom was very, very different from the concept of freedom today. Their concept was that you have a right as a free individual to keep everything you earn, and you decide what to do with your own money. So they also didn't have welfare, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. This was the idea of economic liberty. You make it, you earn it, you engage in the free marketplace, you provide goods and services to people, and then you keep your money and you decide what to do with it. I think that the income tax totally inverted that relationship, where the government is the servant, into making government the master, where the government, it seems to me, is effectively nationalized income. Everybody's income belongs to the government, and then they decide how much everybody's going to be permitted to keep, and so they decide the percentage. And by doing that, it's sort of like an allowance that a parent has to the children. And I think that's the real crux of this thing, is they destroyed the concept of what a genuine freedom is with respect to what a person does with his own money.
The courts have held consistently over the years, and I can't think of anything that contradicts it, that Congress has the power to tax anything it wants, and in practically any way it wants. The one limit was if it puts a direct tax, which no one was sure what that was beyond a head tax. If the Congress imposes a head tax, the money raised has to be proportional to the populations of the various states according to the census. That's about the only limit on the manner of taxation. But what it could tax, the courts have said consistently, it's open season. And this was driven home in a case in 2007 of a woman who won an award for psychic damages and loss of reputation because she was a whistleblower for the New York Air National Guard. I forget what it was doing. It was doing some environmental thing, and she complained about it and was then badly harassed, I guess. She worked for that Air National Guard. She was harassed, so she sues on the basis of mental anguish and loss of reputation, and she gets an award. And the IRS claims that she had to be taxed on that. And she said, "What do you mean I have to be taxed on that? Congress passed a law that says damages paid for injury are not taxable." And the IRS came back and said, "You didn't read it closely enough. It says for physical damages. It says nothing about mental damages or loss of reputation." And so she had to pay. And the Supreme Court, and it went to the appellate court. It was upheld. It went to the appellate court. And during the appellate process, the government, this was under the Bush administration. This was a three-judge panel headed by Doug Ginsburg, who's considered something of a libertarian. The government argued that basically, number one, it does count as income because the Congress did not exclude it from gross income. And number two, even if it doesn't count as income, that doesn't matter because Congress has the power under the Constitution to tax anything it wants. The three-judge panel reversed itself. They had initially found with the woman. They reversed themselves and said, yeah, you're right. So as things now stand, and the government argued, and by implication it's adopted by the court, if the Congress chooses not to tax something that you get, then you would need to attribute that to, and this was the government's, was the petition's language. You attribute it to the generosity of Congress. So that's how things stand now. Congress can pass anything it wants. It can tax anything it wants. And if it doesn't tax something, just get down on your knees and be thankful that it decided not to tax it because it could have.
Yeah, it's that system that goes for under the name of freedom. And that's what's so bizarre about the system in which we live. I mean, at least libertarians have a grip on reality. We know that a system in which the state can do the type of thing you're describing, tax whatever they want, call it an income and so forth, that there is no way to reconcile that with a free society. I mean, it was like I said earlier, a free society is one where not only are you free to decide what to do with respect to religion, whether to go to church or not, what to read and not, free speech, it's also the right to decide what to do with your own money. It's your money. It doesn't belong to society. It doesn't belong to the state. And I think this notion that where it's been inverted, that your money does belong to society, that's been one of the great destroyers of freedom in the 20th century, the 21st century. I mean, it's bizarre to me that people honestly believe that you can be living in a free society when the government wields maximum omnipotent authority over what you earn. And I think that's the fundamental issue here is what is the nature of freedom? What does it mean to be free? And can you truly be considered free in a society in which government has the authority to take whatever it wants from you? I just don't see it. And the flip side is this is what it funds is the welfare warfare state. And people look at this and say, oh, well, gosh, how would we fund the welfare warfare state without this giant income tax? Well, they're missing the point. Is that it's because the government has all this largesse at its disposal that it does these things like the welfare warfare state. If you got rid of this tax, that would deplete the government of many of its resources. It couldn't do a lot of the damaging things it does. And so I think we also have to question it. So it's not surprising that another one of your great books is Tethered Citizens, Why Time to Repeal the Welfare State, because they go hand in hand. They're flip sides of the same coin. And that's why as libertarians, we question not just the income tax, well, any tax, but also what the tax funds. I don't see how you can look at one without looking at the other.
Yeah, you like to point out that Americans lived for over 100 years without the income tax. I like to point out they lived for 8 years without the national government having the power to tax, period. And they let that slip away. That's one of the great tragedies of American history. I'm very serious about that. No central government taxation. Now, it's true the states could tax, and the national government, the Congress, had to go to the states to get money. And sometimes I guess they said, well, okay, the check's in the mail, don't worry about it. And maybe the check never showed up. So they didn't like that system very much. But the states, only the states have the power to tax. But when the states, it's much easier to move state to state if you don't like the tax rates than it is to move out of the country, especially once it became a continental country. Now it's very costly to leave the United States to avoid the income tax. There also aren't many places to go, but I'd rather have the states competing with each other if they were the only taxing authorities competing with each other, and because I think that would tend to put a lid on the tax rate. So I think that would have been a much better situation. Unfortunately, our ancestors let that one go. But sure, the spending side is also important, but we should always keep in mind if they couldn't tax, they'd have nothing to spend.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. You're of course referring to the period of the Articles of Confederation, and so here the framers meet at the Constitutional Convention. Everybody thinks they're going to just reform the Articles, the federal government was very, very weak, didn't even have the power to tax, and people like that. They like the idea of a weak government. And so they bring into existence the Constitution, much to everybody's surprise, which calls into existence the federal government. But even then, there was much reluctance to adopt the federal government. And the idea was that they had to convince people that this was going to be a government of limited enumerated powers. And so you always have had this long debate in American history between people basically with a libertarian framework and then people with a statist framework. And I think the only reason they were able to get the federal government into existence is their ability to convince people that this was going to be a government of very few enumerated limited powers, and that it would not be a government that would be taxing incomes. There was the tariff, and people, the statists certainly supported that, the infant industry argument and all that. But the fact that Americans lived without an income tax, whether they had the authority to enact it or not, the fact is they lived without it, I think is a testament to our American ancestors understanding that we don't want to have anything to do with this type of European type inquisitorial system. We don't want an IRS. We don't want to have to be running to the post office and filing our returns. We want the freedom to keep everything we earn and to decide what to do with it. So it's not surprising that they didn't have welfare and Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And then, Sheldon, I would argue that the weaker your government, the stronger your people. And I think that's why America was such a strong nation, is that you had a relatively weak government, at least as compared to today, not as weak as under the Articles of Confederation. But the citizenry then becomes stronger people, more self-reliant, more industrious, more independent, and, oh, by the way, more charitable as well, because there was a tremendous outburst of voluntary charity in the 19th century when people were free to do whatever they wanted with their own money.
Well, I want to go back to the complaints about the Constitution. One of the clauses that got so much attention from the anti-federalists, who were certainly closer to the libertarians than anybody in the Federalist camp, was the taxing provision of Article 1, Section 8. People like Brutus, they wrote under pseudonyms, as did the Federalists, the three authors of the Federalist Papers, Brutus and others, constantly railed through that period about the open-ended, unlimited nature of the taxing clause in Article 1, Section 8. They said it. They weren't listened to. They were right. We shouldn't be surprised by income taxation. The people ended up putting much too much faith in the rulers, which they should have known better than to do. The fact is, when the court finally got around to ruling on the income tax in 1895, they said there's no question that the federal government can tax wages and salaries. The only reason they struck down the 1894 law was that it also taxed the income from property, both real property and personal property, like stocks and bonds. And they said that's equivalent to a direct tax on the property itself, and that would require apportionment among the states, and the bill didn't do that, the law didn't do that, so therefore that part of it's unconstitutional. Now, you might say, well, why didn't they knock down the tax on wages and salaries? The reason they didn't do that, the reason they did knock it down, is that they said that if we don't knock it down, the full burden of this tax will now be on wage earners, and that was not the intent of Congress. Therefore, the whole act has to fall, and they killed the whole thing. But they're quite clear that Congress has an open-ended power to tax, including wages and salaries. And in 1913 or 14, when they rule on the income tax passed in that year after the amendment was passed, the Brewshaber case clearly says, and there's one paragraph where it uses about 7 synonyms for the term comprehensive, plenary, all-embracing, total. They make it no bones about it that they believe, that court believed, as they said all previous courts have believed, that the government's power to tax is plenary, general, all-embracing. And I have to go back to the Anti-Federalists. They knew it, they read it, they warned about it, but the Federalists were in command and control, and sometimes they even made sure newspapers didn't get delivered to certain people so that the Federalist case would prevail in those constitutional conventions in the states.
All right, well, let's shift to the argument we need to equalize wealth, that there's tremendous disparities of wealth, and that there's people with billions and then there's people with just hundreds, and that this isn't fair, that we just need to equalize things. And it seems to me, that's one of the premier arguments for income taxation, the graduated income tax, progressive income tax. And it seems to me, Sheldon, that's just an argument for envy and covetousness. I just don't see why it should matter that somebody has more when somebody has less, especially if your system is that everybody's better off than they would be if you had a system of total equalization of wealth. For example, if you look at Cuba, most everybody's equal. And North Korea is probably even a better example. Everybody's equal in the sense that everybody has nothing. And that's what happens when you have a system where the state is taking everything in order to equalize wealth. And that's essentially the argument behind the income tax. We're going to take from the rich and give to the poor. And if they had just left things alone, if they hadn't adopted this progressive income tax in the early part of the 20th century, it seems to me that despite the tariffs, that there would have been a tremendous base of prosperity in this country due to the achievement of large amounts of capital, productive capital. That's what makes workers more productive. That's what causes higher degrees of profits, higher wage rates. I mean, this, to me, is the key to a prosperous society, is where the private sector is able to accumulate ever-growing massive amounts of wealth through savings. But the more the state confiscates from the private sector in order to so-called equalize wealth, there's no doubt in my mind that really this is a tremendous assault on poor people in general. In the name of helping the poor, they are actually creating the conditions that harm the poor.
Well, it's true. It hasn't done anything to equalize wealth. That was only one of the reasons offered for the income tax. I'm not even sure it was the major one. They tended to rely on the ability to pay principle and also the related idea that and I'm not saying this is a valid argument, but that the more money you make, the more you benefit from the security provided by government. I mean, those were I think the two major arguments. The people that talk about equalization of wealth, whether it's in terms of the income tax or any other way, because they do talk about it now, are phonies, because they never look at the real things that tend to help the well-off and harm the worse off. They don't look at things we've gone through before: licensing, zoning, I'd say intellectual property, all kinds of ways that the government helps the people who've already made it and puts weights on the people who have not yet made it. The progressives never look at those things. I've never heard progressives talk about getting rid of licensing, occupational licensing, which affects even like people that want to be florists, hairdressers, etc. So if they really cared about having income be more equal, they would be looking for the ways that the system impedes people from acquiring wealth. It seems very simple. Instead, they talk about things like minimum wage and stuff that's easily debunked and won't change the income distribution whatsoever. So it's a big fraud. The income tax certainly hasn't done that. And I don't even hear them talking anymore about the income tax in those terms. I mean, they do talk about, they used to talk about under Obama, they wanted to put the rates back up after they were dropped during Bush on the people making $250,000 or more. But again, that was voiced more in terms of ability to pay, and we don't want to raise them on the poor, so we should raise them on the rich. It all gets muddled, of course, but you're absolutely right. I mean, all this just sucks capital and resources out of the economy and throws it down the drain when it could be used productively, making everybody better off.
Yeah, it's interesting if you go back to some of these debates when they were arguing over the 16th Amendment and income taxation in general. Even the lawyers during the Pollock case in the 1800s, there's this sense that this was a socialist apparatus that was being imported into America. And it's interesting that you mentioned the progressives. I think they played a critically important role of importing this idea from the socialists in Europe, along with other ideas like Social Security, public schooling, and so forth that came from the socialists. And one of the things I learned about when I first discovered libertarianism, that I was just shocked, because we all grow up with this kind of system and we think it's normal and we think this is what freedom's all about. When I learned in the Communist Manifesto that they were calling for a graduated income tax in the Communist Manifesto, and I was just stunned. I said, what do you mean the Communist Manifesto? How can it be in the Communist Manifesto when it's here? They're telling me in public schools and college and everything that this is a free system, the graduated income tax. And I think it really goes to show you, how Americans are, they embody the words of Johann Goethe, that none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free.
Well, I think most of that stuff came from Bismarck in Germany, so it didn't come from Marx. In fact, Bismarck was trying to put down the Marxists by giving goodies away to workers and pensions to people who were getting older. That was a way to keep them from going into the Marxist camp. But the same principle is there. Of course, it's the state engineering things and taking money from people and because it believes it knows better how to use it. So those things all. I think we can trace them to some common principle, namely that the state knows better, period. And you can find that coming from all kinds of directions, right, what we call right and left, and even center. I agree with your point that we're taught about freedom, but this somehow is supposed to be understood within freedom. The fact that government takes your money and then gives it to you if you fulfill certain obligations and conditions, and sometimes gives it to other people altogether. This is not how we understand freedom. I think we can make a pretty good case that's not what freedom means.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what I think distinguishes us libertarians from conservatives. I mean, conservatives are always calling for tax reform and lower income taxes and more loopholes and more deductions. Libertarians are raising people's vision to a higher level. We want to get rid of the income tax. We'd like to get rid of all taxes, but at least the income tax, because it's such a direct assault on people's liberty and privacy. And so we necessarily challenge the existence of the tax itself. We're not just interested in lower income taxes. We want to pull this weed out by its root. And by the same token, we challenge the morality and the usefulness of the whole welfare state paradigm, the drug war and so forth. We want to dismantle these things of the warfare state. I'm going to get rid of the foreign interventionism and the foreign empire and the whole national security state apparatus. And that's really what distinguishes us, Sheldon, I think, from conservatives as well as leftists, is that, they're always calling for reform of the NSA or the IRS. We want to dismantle these things because we want a free society. And we know that these things are inconsistent with a free society. Along those lines, Sheldon and I are going on tour again next week. Well, not this week, but the following week. We're going up in Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, and the whole schedule is on our website at FFF.org. If you're in those areas, come and join us. We're going to be doing this in conjunction with Young Americans for Liberty chapters on certain college campuses, but it's certainly not limited to students. And we're going to take this show, The Libertarian Angle, live on these campuses, and we're going to be discussing things like this because our objective of going to these groups is to show them, to share with them the critical importance of principle. Why principles are so important and why we can't ever afford to compromise or actually abandon libertarian principles in the quest for freedom. That by sticking to the principles is how we're going to achieve the free society. So that's the show. Enjoyed it once again. Thank you, Sheldon. And we'll probably be skipping next week because we'll be on tour, but we'll see you the following week. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.